Okay, so to everyone who's tuned in already, we're going to start soon. We're just waiting to connect the STAR coordinator, and then Neha will kick things off for us. Thank you very much for your patience. I think these past months have showed how trying it is to try and do things virtually, and we're all practicing and doing by trial and error, and we clearly learned from the mistakes of our colleagues who went on a little bit before us, but we'll try to make this as smooth as possible. Thank you.
Yes, we've spent most of the day learning.
Okay, it says waiting for approval. So maybe Neha, you have to do it on your main computer.
I've sent him an invite.
Yeah, but if you minimize the PowerPoint on your main screen, because it might be there.
All right. Hello?
There we go.
Hi, Mio. Thanks for joining.
Okay, so let's start. Maybe Neha, if you want to kick off then. Thanks.
Excellent. Yes, let me just share the screen before we get started. All right. So just thank you for joining us, everyone. Just to start us off before we begin the session, just a few, for lack of a better word, housekeeping aspects. If as you join, if you're able to just share your name and your organization, that would be really helpful for us as we move along, and especially for the Q&A. Feel free to ask questions as you go along, and we can stop in between or take them in the end. I'm Neha Zaigham, and I'm the Communications and M&E Monitoring and Evaluation Officer at the STAR, Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative. That's a joint partnership between the Unodc and the World Bank. And Elsa, who's our speaker today, she's the Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Officer at the Unodc, based here in Washington. She'll be talking us through what STAR is and generally asset recovery and our work around that. So feel free to add your questions as we go along in the chat, and we will also be posting some links for publications and access to our newsletter and signing up for that. So just you can keep an eye on that as we go on. So without any further ado, I think I'll pass it on to Elsa.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening to those. I think we just have a colleague from India who's joining, so that must be quite the time difference, but we're really happy to contribute. So my name is Elsa Gopala-Krishnan, and I work for both the Unodc and the World Bank Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative. I'll be explaining in a few minutes what that is. But we're really happy to be part of the Unodc booth over these 24 hours and contribute to the discussion on the work that Unodc does also with the private sector in the context of the Global Compact principles. So as Neha said, a couple of housekeeping. Please ask us questions, and Neha will be sharing some information links also as we go through. But I think it would be interesting to have a more interactive discussion. And also, if you simply want to contribute any information about your own project or the work that you're doing related to asset recovery and the private sector. We also have Emile. I'm not going to say his last name. He can say that himself on the line here. Maybe Emile, do you want to introduce yourself also?
Good afternoon, morning for some, who knows, night for others, evening for others. My name is Emile van der Roostvilleroy. I am the coordinator for this initiative, Joint World Bank UNODC project that aims to assist countries in recovering the proceeds of corruption from financial centers. Elsa, you'll be leading the debate. If I need to jump in, let me know. Thank you.
Great. Sorry, just one more thing before we get started. To point out, for those who are just joining the summit for the first time today, if you double-click on the screen for where the presentation is, it'll maximize it, so you'll be able to see it much more clearly and still be able to see everyone else on the side.
Thanks, Neha. And also, we're a fairly manageable group, so please don't hesitate. Also, if something goes too fast or if you have a tech issue, just to flag it in the chat. And we do ask, like the colleagues who are also doing it here, that when you join, if you could let us know who you are and also if you want to contribute in any way. So I'll probably start by making a bit of a plug also for some of the other sessions that have gone on. There were some really interesting sessions today from the Unodc booth also on a survey done in Colombia. And so I hope that you'll be able to access that recording. That was really fascinating. And the head of the Colombia office is always a very engaging presenter. Our executive director, Gada Wali, will be doing also a presentation overnight, unfortunately Vienna time, so I think it's 3 or 4 in the morning for the East Coast, but it will be also recorded, and she will speak about the topic at the high level segment of the summit. So I encourage you to tune in for that if you can. Also last week, the director of our division for treaty affairs at UNODC, which is the division that oversees the UN Convention Against Corruption, also did a talk at the Global Compact Academy, so which you can find online, and I think Neha can provide also the link to that in the chat. So you'll also have some more information about UNODC and its work with the private sector and the implementation of Principle 10 of the Global Compact. So just to perhaps get into the meat of our topic, and it's a fairly technical topic, so don't hesitate to ask questions as we go along. Neha, if you can go on the first on the. Mm-hmm. Sorry, we're going to have to toggle between 2 or 3 screens here. So please bear with us. But yeah, everyone is learning by doing on this platform. So first of all, I think for those maybe who are not familiar with the topic, what is asset recovery? Asset recovery is a process that includes the tracing, freezing, confiscation, return of illicitly required assets. The legal basis, as I mentioned, is our legal instrument called the UN Convention Against Corruption, the UNCAC, that several other colleagues in earlier booth sessions have referred to. And it's a universal instrument in the true sense of the word, because there are 187 parties to it, so almost a global universal ratification of the instrument. I mean, this is all a bit dry language to actually speak about a phenomenon that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, which is the theft of public assets by, for instance, kleptocrats or dictators in certain countries. And I'm sure that even just from news reports, you'll be very familiar with the topic, between the loot that was obtained in Nigeria by Sani Abacha, or in Haiti by Duvalier, or by Marcos in the Philippines. So this is the topic that we're working on. And we'll be happy to also give you a bit more information, perhaps at the end, about some data and research also on that topic. Neha, thanks. So, as I said, one of the I think the immediate kind of concerns or issues that we have in the space of asset recovery is, why is asset recovery important? I mean, there are several issues that come to bear when we talk about this topic. I mean, the first is a political case. So corruption, of course, harms societies, will entrench poverty, and also takes away stability from countries and regimes. There's a development case for it, and I think that a couple of colleagues also referred to the fact that the SDG, so the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Addis Agenda of 2030 also now refers to asset recovery and return as one of the targets to be able to combat this. And there's a rule of law case. So the idea is to make sure that there are no longer any safe havens, that there's end to impunity, and compensation also for the victims of corruption. And victims of corruption, by the way, not just from public embezzlement of funds, but also can be from the private sector. Neha? Thanks. So as I said, our legal basis so the legal provisions that we work on are based in the UN Convention Against Corruption that I will just screen here in Chapter 5 on asset recovery. And I think one of the aspects that make this convention so innovative is that this is the first one that has any provisions about asset recovery globally. So whether we're talking about regional or sectoral instruments. And by virtue of essentially most of the countries of the world having ratified it, all of the countries in the world are supposed to implement its provisions. And the baseline principle that the convention sets out is that illicitly stolen assets should be returned to the country of origin or the victim country. And so a lot of the work, for instance, that Unodc does is to make sure that countries have adequate legal frameworks, but also institutional capacity to be able to carry all of this out. And one very important aspect of the convention is that it's not only a legal instrument and a document, it also has teeth in the form of a monitoring mechanism that has been carried out since 2010 and covers all countries and covers all chapters of the convention. And perhaps if I have some time towards the end of this talk, I can maybe say a bit more about that, specifically on the review mechanism. So the origin of the STAR initiative, the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, is that after the convention was adopted in 2006, there was clearly a need for specialized technical expertise and advisory services to be able to assist countries in this new and innovative and really complicated topic of asset recovery. And so Unodc, which is a fairly small organization and very, very specialized, started also looking at other organizations and what kind of partnerships or sort of team building could be done to facilitate this. And the natural partner in this sense was the World Bank. The World Bank is highly specialized in anti-corruption and anti-money laundering, and looking both at the at the country level, but also in global policy. And so at that stage, Unodc and the World Bank concluded this partnership called the STAR Initiative, which has been going since 2007, to be able to support the implementation of Chapter 5 through technical assistance. Now, the technical assistance takes several forms, and I'll go into a couple of those a bit later. But the basic idea is that Unodc and the World Bank, through the STAR Initiative, will try to facilitate a timely and return of legally acquired assets. So we essentially try to support international asset recovery. As I mentioned earlier, the STAR Initiative objectives are to end safe havens for corrupt funds, to support the international efforts to confiscate and recover assets, and to also do the end part, which is return the assets to the legitimate owners. So we've been running for over 10 years now, and we work with a whole variety of stakeholders, whether it's governments, civil society, the private sector, and also other organizations working at the policy level. So that's the basic, what's screened there are the three essential ways that STAR carries out its work, and then the fourth one, which is cross-cutting on communications. Essentially, the STAR Initiative carries out country work, and country engagements form the backbone of our work. We are able to provide assistance to countries upon request when they're trying to make progress in their asset recovery cases. The second area, and I'll say more about that in a little while, is on knowledge development. So we have a whole host of tools and resources and publications that are essentially the number one publications and resources used by asset recovery practitioners and that are available to them. And so we'll be walking you a bit through that. Then a very important aspect of our work, which is policy and partnerships. And part of that explains our presence here today at the Global Compact Summit. because we try to also bring this issue to the fore in different types of spaces and policy discussions. The last area is communications, and perhaps Neha, you can put the Twitter handle and our websites. If you look at the other screen, I've just shared the screenshot of our website there. It will be changing in the next months, but you can still find a lot of the information there if you need it. So what I wanted to do perhaps is to go through maybe a couple of more specific aspects with regard to the work that STAR does, and to go through the different work pillars. And then also, if we have a little bit of time, to flag specific provisions in the UN Convention Against Corruption that deal with cooperation with the private sector. But I'll maybe pause there for a minute to see if there's any initial questions or comments. Okay, so I think so. Assistance is bilaterally or through Unodc. Great question. So the country work, like specific country work with STAR, is done from STAR, which is a joint project of both organizations that gets a request from a specific government and then delivers the assistance needed. And this assistance can take many forms. It can be in legislative reviews or legislative support, so drafting laws and provisions on asset recovery. It can be capacity building, so doing specialized trainings for financial investigators or prosecutors. It can also be support in creating contacts or facilitating contacts between, say, a country who's trying to request assets from another jurisdiction and having trouble, for instance, finding the right people or understanding the other legal system. So the assistance is provided, I would say, yes, from the STAR initiative bilaterally to each requesting government. I hope that answers the question. And some countries, for instance, have called on the private sector to support their work also in terms of asset recovery by the engagement of private lawyers or investigators to assist in tracing assets that are abroad, which is a very complex undertaking in most situations. And we have some guidance that we have put together also in our asset recovery handbook and other publications about best practices for countries to be careful about when doing that, and also the kind of framework agreements to look for. Main challenges. So, how is joint efforts? Thank you, Aran. That's a great question. So I think a lot of the challenges that we have faced when assisting the countries is trying to, well, with international asset recovery is, countries come to us oftentimes in the context of regime change. And so we'll be transitioning from, one administration to the other. So I think the typical example would be, for instance, the countries from the Arab Spring. So Egypt and Tunisia, that had to, in a very short period of time, turn around not only their government and regime, but also try to trace the assets that were hidden abroad by the leaders that they toppled. And so one of the issues was immediately getting that system off the ground, was obtaining assistance from other countries where the assets were stashed, and enabling them to essentially try to return them. So I think that's part of it. I would also say, some of the other challenges is, of course, sort of weak capacity among financial investigators and prosecutors, the law enforcement colleagues who need to carry out this work. That obviously represents a problem when dealing with these very technical and highly complex asset recovery cases. On the second part of your question, I think the joint efforts and partnerships. I think so. In a couple of countries, perhaps I'm not going to name any now, but when we do country work, of course we have to do that on request of the government. But we typically also try to involve other stakeholders at the national level, so private sector and civil society. And in a couple of cases, that has been a very effective lever for advocacy. for some of these efforts when, for instance, the political will has perhaps been waning a little bit in those countries to be able to keep the issue of asset recovery on the front burner very, very strongly. And that clearly in two of the countries that we've worked, that has been very effective. So I think that's clearly one of the, in terms of country work, one of the, I think, the most useful aspects. But if anyone else has any ideas or any questions, then please go ahead. So maybe I'll just we'll still look if there's any questions, but maybe to look at a little bit on policy and partnerships, some of the work that we do, and I'll just mention it, and please don't hesitate to follow up in the chat or later on with us for more. So, for instance, one of the partners that we do work with is the International Bar Association. The IBA, because of its obvious relationship to some of these cases and some of the policy and knowledge work on asset recovery at the global level. And so we did a recent publication called Going for Broke, which looks at the use of insolvency proceedings in asset recovery. And perhaps we can, I'll just quickly share with you the place on the STAR website where you can find all the publications. So it's
and
there.
I'll be sharing all the links shortly as we
exactly
get with
okay, so that's Going for Broke. Right. So that's one of the partnerships that we have. We're also working with them on an upcoming project on the role and standing of victims of corruption in proceedings, criminal proceedings. Some of the recent cases that we've seen, for instance, in France, have really emphasized the role of other routes than the intergovernmental route towards asset recovery, and so we're very excited about that. I see Emile is back on. Emile, would you like to say something about the PASI and the World Economic Forum? We can't hear you.
Hi, thank you. Yes, so we're working together with the World Economic Forum on a panel that was going to be a much bigger panel, of course, because it was going to be an in-person thing, like so many events. But we are working with them on the role, focusing on the role of enablers in corruption cases. So what role have lawyers, accountants, banks, financial institutions been playing in a bad way, let's say, by facilitating corruption and by really setting up structures that enable corruption, setting up corporate structures to funnel away funds, and what role can they play in positive sense by affirming customer due diligence obligations and by ensuring that those who want to embezzle funds or want to pay bribes or want to receive bribes, that those types of transactions and those types of clients are highlighted and brought to the attention of relevant authorities. So we have in the past very much focused on it in a sort of negative way, needing to clamp down on it. We're now also trying to build those alliances, both through the World Economic Forum, but also, as Elsa mentioned earlier, with the International Bar Association, in helping to highlight how private sector can help both victims of corruption through the IBA and as gatekeepers to the financial system, bringing to the attention of authorities through the anti-money laundering systems what is going wrong, but also in a more affirmative way, helping to affirm standards of ethics in those different private sector bodies, private sector professions and businesses. Thank you.
Thanks, Emile. So Oh, we have a very technical question here from Gaurav. So should the request for information detailing the assets be by way? That's a great question. Perhaps then I'll spend maybe just a minute or two explaining the different forms that Gaurav is referring to, and then the scope of work. Well, actually, I'll do the scope of work first. So it's yes, the STAR initiative works on asset recovery related to corruption offenses. So the offenses which are contained in the UNCAC. And those count, as you mentioned, money laundering, but not tax evasion. The UNCAC criminalizes several different types of bribery, obstruction of justice, money laundering, embezzlement by public officials, bribery of both national public officials and also international public officials. And importantly, it also criminalizes bribery and embezzlement in the private sector. So I think it's a very interesting question because I feel sometimes we can be seen as limited in our mandate because we do focus on asset recovery and corruption cases. But frankly speaking, the assistance that we provide, especially at the country level, on looking at frameworks for asset recovery, on training investigators and prosecutors, applies to all types of serious crime. And so one thing that we do try to do is also remember that there are international cooperation frameworks, for instance, that are in other instruments, such as the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, which are very similar to the Convention Against Corruption's framework. And so this really builds a corpus juris of provisions at the international level that deal with international cooperation and that really should be applicable to all types of serious crimes. Specifically, and interesting that you should mention tax issues, because we are working also on an upcoming paper publication with regard to tax and incorporating those issues more into our work. And perhaps when I'm done, Emil can also say another word about that. But on your first question, whether the request for information should be by way of letter of rogatory, that's the formal channel. So there's multiple channels to be able to request information from countries. And the letter of rogatory, it represents the most formal one. So mutual legal assistance and international cooperation in that sense, which also is regulated in the UN Convention framework. But there are other means to do that. We always advise countries to consult informally their partners before they send a formal request. There's also police-to-police cooperation. And very importantly, there's cooperation between financial intelligence units. So FIUs and STAR works very closely with the Egmont group, which is the group of FIUs, to be able to support their work also. Emil, did you want to say a word about tax? Your mic's not on.
Apologies. Yes, sorry. It's a very interesting question, Gaurav, and it's absolutely true that there is more to be done on the tax front, and particularly on the cooperation between tax authorities and law enforcement authorities. And we think that if you, I think Elsa mentioned in her introductory comments the SDGs and the 16.4 of the Sustainable Development Goals on illicit financial flows. And I think the term has been criticized, and I can understand it because it tries to put a lot of different things under one umbrella, and that can be unhelpful. But I think where it's very helpful is in trying to force some cooperation and recognition of the fact that tax authorities and law enforcement authorities should be working towards the same goals, which is recovering assets for government, and that there is a lot, I think, that law enforcement can learn from the way that tax authorities have been collaborating for a longer period of time. And so our forthcoming publication will really look at the ways in which particularly law enforcement can learn from tax authorities, international cooperation, but also the other way around. What can tax authorities, for instance, learn from law enforcement, and how can those different categories collaborate in a more effective way. That is to say, how can information be exchanged between them? Because often you will find whatever realm you're in, the information exchange has a clause that says this is only to be used for, let's say, for tax purposes. And that means that sharing beyond tax authorities becomes problematic. So we're looking at models where there is sharing beyond those realms, while maintaining due regard for due process. So that is a publication that we hope to launch in the first or second quarter of 2021, together with the Vienna Institute on Taxation. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Emile. So perhaps also with that in mind, we wanted to look at a couple of the, maybe Neha, if you can just put the next screen on, which is the STAR resources page. Exactly. Since we have to toggle between them, Neha will post all the links to all those publications in a minute in the chat, so you can look at that. But we wanted to kind of put everything together in one place in terms of resources. We have a fair amount of publications that we've put out since 2007, several of which are relevant to private sector entities and their work. I think one, for instance, which can be very interesting to look at is public, and I always say this wrong, so I'm going to read the title: Public Wrongs, Private Actions, which is about methods for recovery of stolen assets using other means than the criminal channel, or having to take cases basically through prosecution, etc. That also provides a lot of interesting avenues, I think, for private sector actors who have been victims of corruption to be able to act. A couple of the other publications we have are on the banking sector. One of them, called Left Out of the Bargain, is on the issue of settlements. A lot of the projects that have been funded by Unodc, have been funded for Unodc in the countries that were mentioned in some of the boost sessions earlier, are from the Siemens Integrity Initiative. And the initial impulse for Siemens to set that up and to fund these types of projects was because of a huge settlement that they paid a few years ago. And as part of it, agreed to support anti-corruption initiatives through Unodc. So I think that's an important one to flag. Then we also have our Asset Recovery Handbook, which is being updated right now, and could also have provisions that are of interest, I think, to a number of colleagues here. Okay, sorry. So maybe I'll just pause for a second so that Neha can maybe stop the screen share and thanks. And she's going to put the links to all of those publications then in the chat. If you go to our website, so as I'm screening now, we have all the list of the publications. Several of them also are in different languages. We've tried to translate publications, especially the flagship ones, where we can. So I just mentioned, for instance, the work on financial intelligence units. This was prepared also in cooperation with the Egmont Group. Public Wrongs, Private Actions on civil lawsuits, Left Out of the Bargain on settlements, and one which is a little dated, Politically Exposed Persons Preventive Measures for the banking sector. Okay, great. So we have some of the links coming up now. So are there any more questions, or then I would actually maybe go a little bit into more detail about some of the convention provisions that going a little bit beyond the strict topic of asset recovery on cooperation with the private sector that are still relevant to our work. Emile, do you have anything else you want to flag before I do that?
No, Elsa, I think the public office, public wrongs, private actions is certainly the most relevant here, because it goes into detail as to what action you can take under private law to go after the proceeds of corruption, which is obviously an advantage over, the sort of formal route that we discussed just now on legal assistance is that you are more master of your action, and as a victim, you're not at the mercy of somebody else taking decisions. But most importantly, the fact that the threshold for proof will be lower because you're proceeding in civil law. So if you want to claim that somebody has committed a tort or somehow breached a contract, you will not have to prove beyond all reasonable doubt that another party has treated in a way that has harmed you. Your threshold is lower, and you can go after more parties. You can go after more facilitators. So that is really an overview of the advantages of going in private over criminal route. Yeah.
I just saw that Neha posted the link to Puppet Masters, which is apparently our most downloaded publication. And as the person who was responsible for that, I don't know if you want to say a couple of words or. All right, maybe not then. Then the Puppet Masters is also one of our flagship publications. I'll just share the page up here also. It's extremely popular and I think shows also the interest of the private sector and issues such as that in terms of combating corruption and also enabling asset recovery. So as I'm looking at the page at the same time, so the subtitle of Puppet Masters is How the Corrupt Use Legal Structures to Hide Stolen Assets and What to Do About It. So with that flashy title, and it's about how corrupt leaders or kleptocrats also use these shell companies and other legal structures to be able to hide their assets, and sort of deconstructing that process, looking at who's the beneficial owner and how to actually trace back then the assets to those leaders. So it's a very interesting book also, and I would encourage you to take a look at it if you can. Okay, Neha, if we could go back to the PowerPoint, yes, so I can.
Yes, just before I do though, since I'm in the process of inundating everyone with all these links, I'm also just about to share the link to sign up for our quarterly newsletter, which we would highly recommend everyone signing up for if you're interested in getting more up-to-date information about the kind of work that Elsa has kind of outlined more broadly, and you can find more specific information around the countries that we're engaging with and the kind of technical assistance that they're receiving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as Neha mentioned, that would be great if anyone wants to sign up, and also that's the way to contact us. If you'll find the same contact there, and it provides information about our ongoing activities, which I should have said also are supported. We are since we do technical assistance, we're supported by donors, and we're very grateful for their support, which allows us to do the country work and knowledge and policy work that we do through events like these. Okay, so we're back to the screen share. So I don't see any more questions in the chat, so maybe I would go actually just right at the end of the presentation, just to very quickly go through a couple of things which are really on the convention, so the blue slides, and then come back to the Asset Recovery Watch project in a couple of minutes. Okay, so because I didn't really hear this. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, Elsa, to interrupt, but I saw that a few people have joined us more recently. Welcome. And I just wanted to point out once again that in order for you to be able to see the slides a bit better, you can double click on that thumbnail and it'll make it bigger. you to be able to follow it.
Great, thanks. And please flag in the chat if you want to be added, like for audio or video. And if you have any questions, just put them in the chat. So I haven't really seen this kind of walkthrough in any detail earlier, so I was just going to do this quickly. In the UN Convention Against Corruption, as I mentioned, has a lot of related provisions to the private sector. So provisions that relate to corruption prevention in the private sector were mentioned in quite some detail in earlier booth sessions, but there's also a lot of provisions in the chapters on criminalization, law enforcement, and asset recovery. So the convention, for instance, criminalizes both bribery and embezzlement in the private sector. It holds legal persons liable. It also enables countries to put in place measures for canceling or annulling contracts or withdrawing of concessions when there has been corruption caused. So that is a very big, of course, avenue of action for private sector companies who are victims of corruption. And also, the convention calls for cooperation between national authorities, so investigators and prosecutors, and the private sector. And so if you look at some of the more detailed provisions in these articles, in particular Article 39, you'll see that actually cooperation between the private sector and national authorities, supported also by international organizations such as ours, is really a very important aspect of the work of the convention. One specific issue, for instance, that comes up a lot in the area of asset recovery is the fact that a lot of these assets are very difficult to manage. The convention also has a provision specifically on that, which is Article 31 on asset freezing, tracing, confiscation, but also asks countries to set up specialized agencies or have specialized people to do asset management. And we have a couple of publications about that too, which also mention the fact that countries can effectively use private sector resources to do that, because a lot of private sector entities, whether they're court receivers or those specialized in running real estate, or companies, for instance, that have been seized, often do so much more effectively than the government itself. So I think that's one important aspect. If you can go to the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
So as I mentioned, liability of legal persons under the convention is also required. It can be either civil, administrative, or criminal, but legal persons and so corporations and entities are supposed to be held liable for corruption offenses, and also pay accordingly in terms of sanctions that are effective and proportionate. You can go to the next slide. Thanks. Great. So this is the article I mentioned about cooperation between national authorities and the private sector. And so part of the work, for instance, is that Unodc or the World Bank can provide training also and have instances of concrete corroboration between private sector entities and the work that we do in supporting financial investigations, and also looking at frameworks for asset recovery. I think there's one last one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the convention does address the issue of bank secrecy in saying that there need to be mechanisms that would be able to overcome obstacles with regard to it, both at domestic and the international level. So I think that's also an important thing to remember with regard to what the convention itself calls for in that respect. So did we get any other questions, or we'd stop for a minute to see?
Not at the moment, but
okay. So one aspect which is really interesting, I think, in terms of implementation of the convention, and this also is related to asset recovery, is that thanks to the work which is being carried out in the context of the implementation review mechanism, which is the mandatory monitoring that I mentioned earlier of the convention, there's a lot of information which is being made available on country systems and the work that they do. So typically, countries have to report on their implementation of all these provisions that I just mentioned, and the vast majority of countries have country visits where peer reviewers and the Unodc Secretariat participate in Q&A sessions in following up on some of the practical implementation issues that they have. And so typically, the sessions that cover these articles would include representatives of the private sector, that get to talk to the peer reviewers and to the secretariat. So if you're in research or advocacy, I would advise you to take a look at some of these reports. They're really interesting and very detailed, and they provide a snapshot of how countries are actually implementing some of these private sector cooperation issues at their level, as well as how they're implementing bribery and embezzlement in the private sector. Okay. So if you can scoot back up, sorry, to data collection. So I just wanted to flag one last project before we sign off.
There.
Great. So this is again a bit broader than strictly the topic of cooperation with the private sector, but I think it's also very interesting for those who want a sense of the numbers and who are looking at what the issue is exactly. It's a couple of slides up.
Shall I go back or forward?
Yeah, up. Sorry. Yeah, one down now. Great, thanks. Thank you. Sorry. So one topic that comes up constantly when we discuss the issue of asset recovery is, well, what's the data? What is the volume actually being stolen from countries, and what is the volume being returned to the victim countries or the former owners? And so, as part of this, as part of an effort to have an idea of the numbers that we're talking about, STAR has worked on a couple of previous publications done in cooperation with the OECD on the volume of these assets that have been frozen, seized, confiscated, and returned, but only for OECD countries. So what we're in the middle of now is a big research effort to be able to track those volumes for all countries. If you want to go to the next slide, Neha. What we found in the past is that there's a significant gap between the assets that are frozen and the assets that are actually returned to the victim countries. And so the research shows that there are several reasons for that. There are obstacles that exist that are legal, that are political, that are practical, operational. And so we're trying to pull together an analysis of all those different issues to be able to share later in the year. And so the analysis that we have now is only for OECD countries, and we're trying to broaden it to all countries. Yeah, you can keep going. What is that gap on average? It's, well, if you can go up to one slide, 2 slides up, it's definitely a lot. So for instance, here you can see, or maybe you can't see on the slide, but there's a small, so the first data set that we had was 2.6 billion frozen and only 4.23 million actually returned. On our other publication called Left Out of the Bargain, which only looks at settlements, the proportion was only 3% of settlement funds that have been paid were actually returned then to the jurisdiction, the victim jurisdiction that requested it. So it's a very big gap, I would say, to try and answer your question. Okay, so we can go back, I think, 2 down. One more, yes. So that's the visual. So you can go to the next one. Yeah. Yeah. So perhaps the next one. Great, thanks. So perhaps to end on a positive note, and please keep asking questions. Do you want to go back up to the picture thing? Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
There's also a question in the chat.
Good.
Regard to confiscation.
Another great question. Thank you, Gaurav. So if you look at exactly the article that I mentioned earlier, which is Article 31 of the Convention, Article 31 does ask states to have provisions for freezing the equivalent, essentially, of the amount if the asset is not available. And so one good practice or best practice that we've also flagged in terms of asset management is to try and sell off assets which are difficult to manage. So think of, depreciable assets, perishable assets, things that will lose value over time or actually incur a lot of costs for maintenance and upkeep. So authorities should actually sell them off, put it on escrow accounts so that the value is preserved. And therefore, if you can't retrieve it, or if you lose the case, or if you need to return it to another country, then you still have that equivalent amount. I hope that answers your question. Thank you. Okay, good. All right. So just to end then, perhaps on that little picture thingy, we're very happy that and we hope that the research is actually going to show that there has been progress made in asset recovery cases. And I think that that all of us, and this comes back to our colleague from Mexico's question also earlier, are keen to make sure that we partner up with civil society, with the private sector, and build these types of collaborations, because countries simply cannot go it alone, and we really need, it's an all hands on deck effort. And so we're very happy to be able to participate in forums like this, and also to bring colleagues on board in some of the work that we do. So I'll end there unless there's any more questions or last comments.
Oh, there's another one.
Yes, there is actually. So we collaborate in the sense that the STAR coordinator mentioned earlier on this joint publication that we're doing between the World Bank and OECD. And certainly, if you sign up for our newsletter, for instance, you'll actually get the launch information and the actual publication information as soon as it comes out. And that collaboration, by the way, also takes part of the work that we do with the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group, and the work that we have been doing, for instance, on their work stream on illicit financial flows, because the topics are related.
So I see that we don't have a session scheduled for right after this one. So as we wrap things up, if anybody has any additional questions, we can definitely take a few minutes, since we also started a few minutes late.
Great. I don't know if our colleagues from Colombia, David, are you online? Or maybe if you want to pitch in, or you can request to Neha, because we stopped the PowerPoint, so you can request Neha to put you back on if you want. Or if other colleagues are plugged in, if you want to say something about your projects.
Andrea, are you online? Great. Let me just add.
I don't want to force anyone to speak. If you want to say something, I just found the presentation by Pierre right before the head of the Colombia office so engaging that I thought maybe you would want to say something about the work that STAR does with that.
And just in time, we have Emil also.
Emil, we just wrapped up, so we're waiting for just David to connect potentially.
I added. I pressed the plus sign, but it doesn't seem to give access. David, can you please try again? I will see if. Also. I also sent an invite in case that helps. Oh, we have a question.
I'm not sure. That's not really asset recovery related, I think. But, yeah. I'm not sure what glyphosato is.
Sorry, David, it seems there's some technical issue and for some reason doesn't allow for them to be added.
Okay. Okay, that's fine. But I just pulled up the main page of the Star website. If you can see Gara, for instance, there's a link to the G20 work down there. If you want to look at that. Okay, so unless anyone else has anything, I think we can close this, and definitely please sign up for our newsletter that Neha mentioned in the chat, and we'd be very happy to continue the discussion offline. And we hope you will enjoy the rest of the Unodc booth presentations and also the talk by our executive director overnight. Thank you to my colleague Neha, who jumped in for this at the last minute and mastered all the technical issues without difficulty, and also to Emile who caught up with us on this. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great day, evening, night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, I've turned the video off. I'm also going to leave.